He trusted him completely. That's what makes this story so hard to accept. Because when people talk about betrayal inside Queen, they usually imagine arguments, explosive fights, door slamming, people yelling in dressing rooms. Something obvious, something cinematic. But this wasn't like that. This was quieter, more personal, and far more dangerous. Because Paul Prenter didn't enter Freddie Mercury's life as an enemy. He entered it as someone useful, reliable, present. The kind of person who doesn't demand trust all at once. He earns it slowly through access, through loyalty, through always being there at the right moment. And that's exactly why the damage cut so deep. Because by the time Freddie realized something had gone wrong, this wasn't just a professional relationship anymore. This was someone inside the circle, while someone close enough to influence decisions, shape environments, and quietly affect the distance between Freddie and the people who had known him longest. The band felt it. The atmosphere changed. And what began as trust slowly turned into something no one could ignore. Control. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't that Freddie fired him. It's what happened after. Because once that line was crossed, what came next wasn't anger. It was something worse. Something unforgivable. And this is where the story divides people immediately. Was Paul Prenter protecting Freddie in a world that wanted too much from him? Or was he controlling him in ways no one should have tolerated? Because some people still see loyalty. Others see manipulation. And depending on where you stand, the rest of this story changes completely. Yet not everyone gets close to Freddie Mercury. That's one of the details people misunderstand about him. From the outside, he looked open, larger than life, surrounded by people, always at the center of movement. But proximity is not the same as access. Being around someone like Freddie didn't automatically mean you truly knew him. That had to be earned. And Paul Prenter earned it the way many influential people do. Not through spectacle, but through consistency. He became useful, available, familiar. The kind of presence that slowly shifts from professional to personal, without anyone fully noticing where the line moved. At first, that kind of closeness didn't seem threatening. In fact, it probably looked necessary. Because fame creates chaos. Schedules, travel, pressure, demands from every direction. And in the middle of all that, the person who can organize things, simplify access, and reduce noise becomes incredibly valuable. Especially to someone living at Freddie's level of intensity. And that's how it began. Not with conflict, with dependence. The practical kind first. Then something more subtle, because once one person starts controlling who gets through, what gets filtered, and how the day is structured, they stop being just support. They become a gatekeeper. And gatekeepers don't just manage information, they shape relationships. That shift doesn't happen loudly. It happens in small decisions, small exclusions, small adjustments that look harmless on their own. Until one day, the dynamic around someone has changed. And no one can quite say when it started. The most dangerous kind of influence doesn't arrive as power, it arrives as convenience. That's what made Paul Prenter so difficult to see clearly in the beginning. He wasn't forcing himself into Freddie Mercury's life. He was making himself necessary inside it. The more present he became, the easier it was for everyone around Freddie to accept that presence as normal. And once something becomes normal, people stop questioning it. That's where the balance started to shift. Because being helpful is one thing. Becoming indispensable is something else entirely. By this point, Prenter wasn't just nearby. He was embedded. He understood Freddie's rhythms, his preferences, the pace of his life, the people around him. That knowledge creates leverage, even when it doesn't look aggressive from the outside. It means access is no longer random, it becomes managed. And managed access changes everything. Because once one person starts controlling the flow around someone, they also start shaping what that person sees less of. Not necessarily through lies. Sometimes simply through filtering, delaying, redirecting, discouraging. And that's the kind of influence that can quietly grow without open conflict. Inside a world as intense as Freddie's, that kind of dependence can feel almost comforting. It reduces friction. It creates structure. It makes a chaotic life feel more controlled. But control and care are not always the same thing. And that distinction would become critical later. Because the deeper Prenter moved into Freddie's inner world, the less this looked like assistance. And the more it started to affect the relationships that had existed long before he arrived. Once influence becomes invisible, it becomes powerful. That's the stage the story was entering now, because Paul Prenter was no longer just part of Freddie's daily orbit. His presence had begun to reach outward, into decisions, into atmosphere, into the emotional distance between Freddie and the band. And that's where things stopped being personal in a harmless way. Because Queen was never a simple band. It ran on chemistry, tension, trust, disagreement, and a balance that only worked because each member knew where the others stood. Once that balance starts shifting, even slightly, everyone feels it. And they did. Not all at once. Not through one dramatic confrontation, but through changes in energy. A sense that Freddie was less reachable. That access felt different. That things which used to move directly now passed through a layer that hadn't always been there. That kind of shift doesn't have to be openly hostile to create damage. It just has to be consistent. And consistency changes perception. Because once the people closest to Freddie begin feeling that distance, they start asking questions. Not publicly, not dramatically, but privately. Quietly. They start wondering whether this is just a phase, just pressure, just timing, or whether someone is shaping the environment around him more than they should be. That's when tension begins to harden, because now the issue is no longer one man getting close to Freddie. It's whether that closeness is changing Freddie himself. And once a band begins asking that question, trust starts to crack. At first it felt subtle, not a break, not a confrontation, just distance. The kind that's hard to explain but impossible to ignore. Inside Queen, everything had always depended on access, communication, friction, the ability to challenge each other directly. That's how their music worked, that's how their decisions were made. But now, that access felt different, less direct, less immediate, because Freddie wasn't as reachable as before. Not physically, emotionally, and that's a very different kind of absence. Because when someone is still there but harder to connect with, it creates uncertainty. You start to second guess. You hesitate before pushing. You wonder if something has changed, or if you're imagining it. But they weren't imagining it. Because between Freddie and the rest of the band, there was now a layer. And that layer had a name. Paul Prenter. He wasn't openly blocking anything. He didn't need to. All it took was presence, timing, influence over what reached Freddie, and what didn't. And over time, that changes behavior. Because when communication stops being direct, relationships start shifting. Not loudly, but permanently. And once that shift takes hold, it doesn't stay contained, it spreads. And that's when the band stopped feeling like four people moving together, and started feeling like something else entirely. Tension doesn't explode immediately. It builds, layer by layer, until eventually it becomes impossible to ignore. And that's where things were now. Because what had started as distance was turning into something sharper, something harder. Inside Queen, disagreement had never been a problem. It was part of the process. Yeah, but this felt different. Because now the tension wasn't just about music. It was about influence, about who was shaping decisions, about whether Freddie was still fully connected to the band or being pulled in another direction. And that's when it started to surface. Not in one moment, but in many. Conversations that didn't go the same way. Decisions that felt less collaborative. A sense that something, or someone, was interfering with the natural dynamic that had always defined them. Brian May and Roger Taylor could feel it. They didn't need proof, they felt the change. Because when you've built something over years, you know when the energy shifts. And this shift wasn't small, it was structural. Because now the question wasn't just about music anymore, it was about trust. And once trust becomes uncertain, everything else follows. Because without it, every decision feels heavier. Every conversation feels guarded. Every silence feels intentional. And that's when the situation stops being sustainable. Because bands can survive conflict, but they don't survive when the connection itself starts breaking. For a long time, everything stayed just below the surface. Unspoken, unconfirmed, but felt. And then something changed, because there's always a moment when uncertainty turns into clarity. Not gradually, suddenly. A realization that cuts through everything that came before it. And for Freddie Mercury, that moment finally arrived. We don't see it as one dramatic scene. No shouting, no public confrontation. But internally, it was decisive. Because once Freddie saw the situation for what it was, everything shifted instantly. Because the trust that had been built over time didn't weaken. It collapsed. And when trust collapses at that level, there's no negotiation, no slow transition, just a decision. Clear, immediate, final. Because what had once felt like support now looked like something else. Something that had crossed a line, not professionally, personally. And that's the difference. Because professional issues can be managed. Personal betrayal cannot. And once Freddie understood that distinction, there was only one way forward. Not distance, not adjustment, separation. And when that decision was made, it didn't come with hesitation. Because by then, the damage wasn't theoretical anymore, it was undeniable. And once something becomes undeniable, it can't be ignored anymore. There was no negotiation, no second chance. Almost no long conversation trying to fix what had already gone too far. When Freddie Mercury made the decision, it was immediate and final. Because by that point, this wasn't about management anymore. It wasn't about schedules, access, or influence. It was about trust. And trust, once broken at that level, doesn't come back. Paul Prenter wasn't gradually pushed out. He was cut off, completely. No slow distancing, no transition. Just an abrupt end to a relationship that had once been deeply embedded in Freddie's life. And that kind of ending says everything. Because when someone goes from being inside your world to completely removed from it, something irreversible has happened. Something that doesn't allow space for repair. From the outside, it looked like a professional decision. A manager being dismissed. But inside, it was something else. Because Freddie wasn't just removing a manager. He was removing someone he had trusted. Someone he had allowed close enough to shape his environment. And once that level of access turns into something harmful, the only response left is elimination. No explanation, no reconciliation, just silence. And that silence was about to be broken in the worst possible way. After the firing, there was a moment where everything could have ended quietly. No public drama, no escalation, just distance and time. But that's not what happened. Because what came next changed everything. Paul Prenter didn't stay silent. He spoke, publicly. And what he revealed wasn't just information, it was personal. Deeply personal. The kind of details that exist inside trust, not outside of it. And once those details are exposed, they can't be taken back. Because this wasn't just a disagreement turning public. This was something else entirely. A betrayal, not of business, of privacy, of identity. Because when someone who had access to your private life chooses to expose it, they're not just breaking trust, they're weaponizing it. And that changes how everything is seen. Because now, the story isn't about why Freddie fired him. It's about what Prenter did after. And that's where the line was crossed, completely, irreversibly. Because whatever existed before, whatever loyalty, proximity, or connection they once had, was gone. Replaced by something far more damaging. Because once trust becomes exposure, there's no version of the story where that can be justified. After that, there was no recovery, not publicly, not privately, because the damage wasn't something that could be repaired with time. It had already gone too far. For Freddie Mercury, this wasn't just about what had been said, it was about who had said it. Because betrayal doesn't come from strangers, it comes from people who were close enough to know exactly what matters. And that's what made this different. Because the information wasn't random, it came from inside, from someone who had been trusted. And once that kind of boundary is broken, it changes how you see everything that came before it. Because now, the question isn't just what happened. It becomes, how long was this building? And that's where the real impact settles in. Not in the moment, but afterward. In the realization that what felt safe wasn't. That what felt controlled was being influenced, and that what felt like loyalty was something else entirely. And once that understanding takes hold, it doesn't just close a chapter, it rewrites it. Because now the story isn't about a manager being fired, it's about how close someone got before everything broke. From the outside, it can still look like a conflict. A manager fired, a disagreement that escalated, a story that got out of control, but when you look closer, that's not what this was. Because what Freddie Mercury reacted to wasn't just what was said, it was what it meant. Because information can be shared, opinions can be expressed, but trust is something else entirely. And once someone is trusted with access, real access, they are given something that doesn't belong to them. Private moments, personal truths, things that only exist because of that relationship. And when those things are exposed, it's not communication, it's violation. That's what made it unforgivable. Not the disagreement, not the separation, but the choice to take something that was given in confidence and turn it into something public. Because once that happens, the damage goes beyond reputation. It changes how trust is understood, how relationships are built, and how easily they can be broken. And for Freddie, that line wasn't unclear. It was absolute. Because once someone crosses it, there is no version of the story where they come back from it. This story doesn't end with a firing. It ends with a question. Because depending on how you see it, everything changes. Was Paul Prenter someone who got too close and lost perspective? Or someone who knowingly crossed a line that should never be crossed? Because some people still argue that he was protecting himself, that he was responding to being cut off, that what he did was reaction, not intention. But others see it differently. They see a moment where access turned into control, where trust turned into exposure, where someone who had been let in used that position in a way that can't be defended. And that's why this story still divides people. Because it forces you to choose how you define loyalty. Oh, is it staying silent no matter what? Or is it respecting the line that should never be crossed? So now it's your turn. Was Freddie right to cut him off completely? Or did Paul Prenter go too far to ever be forgiven? And if this story changed how you see that moment, or the people involved, stay here. Because some of the most powerful stories in music aren't about what happens on stage. They're about what happens when trust breaks behind it.